Hello, good morning, class. This is Professor Ford here. Occasionally, I want to do a video for you all that reflects on the past week discussion because I think it's worthwhile to talk about it as opposed to just writing a quick email to you. So first off, I am in my kitchen, so if you hear noises in the background, that's what's going on. Second of all, I am wearing a Pokemon shirt that I got as a present from my two boys for my birthday. So just want to get rid of the elephant in the room there. All right. Thank you for a great week of discussion. A couple of things that came up that I think are worthy of repeating. So the first question, where I asked you about an area where you think competitive government may be beneficial, an area where it may be problematic. Um, I thought you brought up some very interesting content areas. So we talked about education, we talked about transportation. Um, I say we, really you. You talked about privatizing prisons. And I think that brings up some of the fault lines or highlights some of the fault lines in the debate over outsourcing, over competitive government, that it tends to be very content area specific. And sometimes those content areas where some people are into competitive government and some people are more hesitant fall along ideological or political party lines, all of which, from the practitioner perspective, highlights the need to be cautious. So if you are in a government management position, you really need to understand the environment in which you are operating to understand, I guess, how feasible contracting out or public-private partnerships might be. What exactly is the public tolerance? What exactly will be the political consequences if you do go for it? A couple other specifics that came up to that question that I want to highlight. One was this question, I think, or this issue, I think Jeremiah brought it up, about whether or not private organizations are going to have that loyalty to government. You said loyalty, but I think even you could bring up the idea of professionalization. Are they trained the same way as our government employees? And to what extent does that matter? If you've had Dr. Nollenberger, he'll refer to an MPA as being an MBA, but with a conscience, and that's a little bit tongue in cheek. But there are certain things that are government specific that we teach that are specific to government that don't translate well into the private sector, and oftentimes it can be messy when you try to bring some of those more private sector values into public sector operations. But again, in my personal opinion, I think that is very community dependent. The context matters a heck of a lot, as does the actual service. I also think a practical takeaway from your discussion was the need to have quality bidding and kind of request for proposal processes in place. In other words, you still have to manage, excuse me, the competitive process as a government manager. So it's a little different. You're not managing people anymore. You're managing a process, but it's important to have those in place. Otherwise, any possible benefits of competitive government aren't going to be realized. You might have a case where the lowest bidder wins by design, but that you also have a suffering of quality, which is obviously against the goal of competitive government. Okay, second one. This question of whether we can fund outcomes instead of inputs. What are the potential problems and how can they be overcome? I thought you really emphasized the problems there. There was less emphasis there at how the problems can be overcome. So that's something I want you to try to pay attention to, especially as we read the edited volume, so our next text. But a couple specifics that came up. One, people brought up a lot of questions around public education, and I do a lot of research on this area, so I admit I enjoy hearing about it. But one of the reasons I think that we all kind of go there is that is a service that is both very expensive. Most expensive thing our state government does is public education. It's an area where we're all familiar. We all have some exposure, either as a taxpayer, as a student, as a parent, to the public education system. And it's also a place where a lot of experiments have been done in terms of competitive government and trying to fund outcomes instead of inputs. And with that, one of the things you brought up was this question of failure. What happens if we try to fund outputs, but then we don't actually reach them? What are the consequences of that? The No Child Left Behind law famously was trying to fund outcomes, and it was very difficult to find ways to kind of, I mean, whether you want to say it was to punish or to motivate lower performing schools, there was never really a good question to what happens with failure. So that's something I want you to think about. You also brought up this issue of performance pay. And performance pay is something I think that we can all, I shouldn't say that, I think many of us can get our head around it and say that, yeah, of course we want to be funding performance. It's a meritocracy. So, if you are a high performing employee, you deserve to be rewarded for it. But that is logistically difficult. And if you take human resources, and you will take human resources if you haven't already in this program, you'll dig into that a little bit more. Okay, finally, the last question about customer-driven approach to government. My main takeaway from your discussion there is that this idea of customer-driven government really is a mindset. I think that, and some of this showed up in your discussion, people get hung up on the idea that they're not customers, they're citizens. There's a fundamental difference there, this private-public divide. But I do think it's more of a mindset in that we care foremost about the needs and wants of the people we serve. I think that's something that most can get their can comprehend, get their head around. But anyways, a very interesting discussion, and that really was the purpose of me assigning this book, Reinventing Government, even though it is a little older, is to get you talking about these things. Because though these concepts, or I guess the writing may be a little dated, the concepts are not all that dated. In fact, they're being realized right now in many different locations, in many different service delivery areas. And it's worth having these debates and looking back at one of the kind of classic texts that motivated this movement in government. Okay, so next week you have same deal. You're going to finish the book. 3 questions there I want you to answer. First one's about government profit centers. To what extent should government be making money, and how really realistic is that? The second question is about anticipatory government, which is something that I think it's all good, right? It sounds good. We want government to anticipate problems and be forward-thinking, but it's a lot easier to, I think, a lot easier to say that than it is to actually live that. And those of us working in the public sector can hopefully shed some light onto why. And then the last question. Is the text revolutionary, outdated, realistic, or something else? A couple things for that one. One, I don't want you to just emphasize the fact that it's old. I know that it was published in 1997. In the past, students have kind of just, that's been their answer. It's old. Yeah, it's old. But when I say it's outdated, I'm not asking you whether it's old. I'm asking you if the ideas in the text are obsolete in the modern governing environment. Unless you think that these concepts are outdated, so I'm giving you the answer here. David Osborne, one of the authors of Reinventing Government, he's still at it. The other author passed away, unfortunately. But David Osborne is currently a fellow at the Progressive Policy Institute, deems themselves radically pragmatic, whatever that means, but you can check out their website if you want to see what he's up to. He's also on Twitter at Osborne David, if that's all one word, if you want to see what some of his newer projects are. But he's still at it, and these ideas are being realized in different areas of local, state, and even federal government. So yeah, maybe the text is a little dated, but I don't think the ideas necessarily are. So I very much look forward to continued discussion. I think you're doing a great job with that. Quick reminder, with the reaction papers, you are responsible for doing 3 of those throughout the course of the 8-week semester. You get to choose the weeks you want to do it, so a total of 3. Any week you choose to do it, I ask that you turn it into the Dropbox on Friday. Many of you have already done 1 or 2 papers. I appreciate that. They have been high quality. If you have any questions, you know where to reach me, and I look forward to another great week of discussion. Thanks.